Hi, everyone. Welcome to the April 11th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I am David Aragona here with my usual co-host, Craig Milkowski. And our plan this week is to take a look ahead at Keeneland on Saturday, an 11-race card on tap. And we're going to focus on their late Pick 5 sequence, races 7 through 11. And it's a really fun card. We've got 3 stakes events that are part of this Pick 5, actually 3 graded stakes. The feature race being the Grade 1 Jenny Wiley for the fillies and mares going a mile and a 16th on the turf. We've got that final Kentucky Derby points race taking place just after that. That is the Grade 3 Lexington. We'll talk about that race from a handicapping standpoint and any possible Kentucky Derby implications. And the other stakes event that does kick off the sequence is the Grade 3 Giants Causeway. That seems to come up a really fun handicapping affair every year, 5.5 furlongs on the turf for fillies and mares. Also a couple of allowance races part of this sequence, races 8 and 11, one for the older horses routing on the dirt, and then another for the 3-year-olds going longer on the turf. And Craig, as we began to do earlier this week, we are showing our faces on the TimeformUS podcast as we do the forecast now. Our plan is to do some live handicapping along with the typical audio version, whether you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's going to proceed as usual, but if you are tuning in on YouTube, you'll see our faces for a little bit, but we're also going to share our past performances and do some handicapping with you in both Formulator and TimeformUS.
Yeah, hopefully that'll help the people watching on YouTube that maybe aren't as familiar with TimeformUS as some others. And but that said, we're going to keep it so that it's audio friendly as well. So yeah, looking forward to trying this out. Maybe we'll have a glitch or two, but hopefully not too much.
Yeah, and our migration of the old TimeformUS site over to DRF.com, which if you've been following things, has been happening over the past year, and at this point is pretty much done. And your TimeformUS users are now exclusively on DRF.com. And I know we've gotten some questions about how to use the new TimeformUS PPs. It's just a slight redesign. They mostly look the same as the old ones. A few things are in different places. Some enhancements have been made. Some things have been streamlined. And we've got some questions from users about them. So we wanted to start using the PPs and showing you how we use them on this podcast. So hopefully that helps you with your own handicapping using TimeformUS. And we're going to do the same thing with Formulator. Obviously, Formulator has been around much longer, and people are much more familiar with how to use Formulator, but we find it a great tool to use, especially for those trainer stats, replays, charts, and whatnot. So we're going to go through all of that as we talk through these races, as we usually would do. And speaking of the races that we're going to discuss this week, Craig, I really liked handicapping this sequence. I find that it's a tough sequence, as is typically the case with these Pick 5s at Keeneland. It seems like these cards are always stacked with not just talent, but contention always runs deep in these races. And personally, when I was going through these races, I found it difficult to find any key horse to single on or really narrow down in any one leg. I found myself having this inclination to spread a lot. So I think this could be a tough one to narrow down to an affordable ticket.
For sure. This reminded me of an Oaklawn card, except with the bonus of having a couple turf races to look at as well. Full, deep, contentious fields. Not sure it's one where I'll actually play the Pick 5 because, as you said, it could get pretty expensive. But even if I don't, I like these races a lot. And I think there is some value to be made. These races are going to be tough, but I kind of look at it, if I can even hit one of these races playing them individually, I could have a decent day. And if I hit 2, it could be a really good day.
Yeah, I feel the same way. If you've got some clever opinions along the way, you could definitely hammer them vertically. But if you can get any of those prices to hit within this Pick 5 sequence and get all the way there, it does feel like one that is going to pay well. Even if it's the kind of sequence that chalks out a little bit, I don't think there are so many odds-on favorites or favorites that are going to be under 2-1 in this sequence that are going to come through. So even if it is a little bit chalky, I think it's still going to pay okay. So it might just be the kind of sequence that you want to try to hit. And if you've got good opinions or really clever opinions with big prices, that's great. But it is one where I don't think you want to be leaving out too many logical horses along the way, as long as you don't have particular negative opinions about them. All right, well, let's get into the handicapping, and I am going to share my screen for those that are watching along with us on YouTube, and we'll take a look at the TimeformUS past performances for the first leg of this sequence, race 7, the Grade 3 Giants Causeway. Like I said at the top, this one going 5.5 furlongs on the turf for the fillies and mares. And I was looking at the weather forecast beforehand, Craig. It does seem like we're going to have a fast main track and a firm turf course this weekend. I know there's some rain occurring in Lexington, Kentucky in the middle portion of the week, but I think we're going to have nicer weather by the weekend. So I don't think we have to worry about course condition too much for this Giants Causeway or the other turf races that are part of this sequence. And every year, Craig, it seems like this comes up a large field, often an oversubscribed field with a lot of contenders involved. And it's no different here. Looking through, I think the morning line favorite is pretty lukewarm in this spot. It's actually the number 11, Elm Drive. I don't know if we definitely want to start with her or somebody else, but maybe we'll start with a couple of the horses that are taking or expected to take money in this race. I don't know if Elm Drive is really going to go off favorite in here because I have some questions about the quality of the fields that she's been facing in Southern California, but she is one that has at least been able to transition her form over to turf recently.
Yeah, she's been decent on turf in Southern California for Phil D'Amato, who has had some success shipping into Kentucky with his turf horses. I don't particularly like this filly. She's one who has yet to try the 5.5 on turf. She debuted at 5 furlongs a long time ago on the dirt, but since then it's been all longer races, a couple 6.5 down the hill, mile on the turf. And 5.5 is just a totally different animal, in my opinion. And the 11 post isn't great either. I won't be surprised if she wins, if she runs well, but she's not for me. I would not use her if I was playing a pick 5 because I just think there's some better options in here. And I think she has some major negatives with that post position and the turn back to 5.5. And one thing we didn't really mention, it's a 5.5 furlong race, but we don't have the red pace flag saying the pace is going to be fast. And it does look to me and the pace projector like there's going to be a clear leader.
Yeah, I'm curious with a few things as far as this pace projector goes. I mean, one of which is the positioning of Elm Drive, because she has competed in those longer sprint races, at least recently, those 6.5 down the hill, as you were saying. And I don't know if she's been in the most competitive pace situations. When she did win her one turf race, she did so right up on a fairly slow pace. I think all of those pace figures for that May 20th race were color-coded blue in TimeformUS. So she doesn't have that much early speed as far as what it typically takes to be forwardly placed in these 5 and 5.5 furlong races. And even though there is not that fast pace flag showing up, I do think we've got a couple of really fast horses that are going to go forward, one of which, of course, is the number 5 BG Warrior. And Greg, even though she's a horse who has probably done her better running on synthetic, I do think she's a contender that we have to discuss in here because, at least from a TimeformUS speed figure standpoint, she kind of fits right with the top contenders. It's really just a question of whether you think this is the right spot for her.
Yeah, I personally think she's pretty dangerous. She's a horse I actually like in here. She's just a 4-year-old filly, so I think she's still improving. She's blazing fast. And when I look at this pace projector, I mean, not only is she shown with a gap back to the others in here, the 7 Port Townsend and the 9 Kiss by Fire, I just think she's better than them. I guess there's the possibility Port Townsend could challenge her, but I'm not sure they actually want to based on her last race. She rated off of it. Almost looked like that was a race where she was even money and maybe it was kind of a schooling session. So I'm not sure they're going to be in any hurry to go up and challenge a horse like BG Warrior. Kiss by Fire, yeah, she leads a lot. But we really haven't seen her set show the kind of speed that we get from BG Warrior. Maybe she'll try, but I just think BG Warrior is a naturally faster horse. And she really hasn't had a lot of chances going 5.5 on the turf. She tried the Franklin last year, a race which went really fast early, and she had very little left for that when Caravel was in there. I can't remember who the horse she was dueling was with at the time. I think it was Twilight Gleaming, maybe the Wesley Ward horse. But this just looks a lot different to me. So I'm actually giving her a pretty strong chance in here.
And she has popped those big speed figures on the turf before, even though her good recent form is over synthetic. Watching her run, to me, she looks a little more comfortable on the synthetic. We see her open up on fields like she does, not in the same way that she's been able to on the turf. Often she finds herself in some more competitive pace situations going a little bit shorter on the turf, whereas in those 6 furlong and 6.5 furlong races at Turfway, she can build up this big advantage by the time they get to the far turn and kind of hang on late, because if she's only up by a length or half a length with a furlong to go, I'm not sure that she's the kind of horse that can dig in and hold on, especially given some of the finishers that we know are in this field. So I do think that she has to build up that 4 or 5 length lead to hold on in a race like this. And I don't know if she's going to be able to, just given the quality of this field, but she definitely adds some intrigue to this race, and especially to the likely pace scenario. Craig, the horse that I kind of expect to go favorite in here is the number 8, Roses for Deborah. She's 4-1 on the line. I'm thinking she's probably going to go off more somewhere in the 5-2 range. She just got really, really good in the middle of last year. Came off the layoff back in May at Pimlico, ran that big race getting on turf for Christophe Clement, and then she just continued on this win streak, won 4 in a row, all by open lengths. And when you're a turf sprinter going 5 and 5.5 furlongs that is winning consistently by 2 or 3 lengths, you're just dominating your fields, because these kinds of races typically have bunched up finishes. And it's really easy to make excuses for her last 2 performances to conclude 2023. She ran him to that boggy course at Parks. We see that 1 track condition rating. And if you're not familiar with what the track condition ratings are in TimeformUS, I know that's something that you engineered, Craig, to sort of give a better sense of how fast or slow courses are actually playing, because sometimes these labels the track's put in there into the charts, firm, good, yielding, that can be highly subjective and they don't mean a whole lot. And the numbers that we put in there next to those in TimeformUS, they're on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being the fastest track, like think of a hard turf course in the middle of summer, and 1 being the slowest, like a total bog, just like we saw in Pennsylvania Derby last year at Pennsylvania Derby Day last year at Parks. I think that gives a better sense of how fast or slow courses are playing, and it's especially important when you see the variability and subjectivity in some of these turf condition ratings. So a 1 rating for that course that Roses for Deborah encountered at Parks last year, and then they tried the Breeders' Cup with her. In retrospect, Irad Ortiz tried to play the break and go forward that day, and she broke on top, and I think he tried to not give away position, but being third in the early stages of that race that was just laden with speed, I think in retrospect, she just did a little bit too much running in the opening quarter, and she lacked the typical kick that we see from her. Coming back off the layoff, I'm not going to be surprised when she gets back to her better form.
No, me either. It's funny you point out that 1. It's a perfect example. I mean, you won't find a softer course than what we had at Parks that day, and yet they labeled it yielding. So I kind of take those labels with a grain of salt. Yeah, I mean, Roses for Deborah is clearly a strong contender in here. I definitely could give excuses for the last 2. This field is nowhere near as good as those. It looks to me like she's been working well. She's certainly been working regularly. So she's a contender, no doubt about it.
There are some other horses that I think we've got to consider. The number 4, Ovra, she's just a win machine at Fairgrounds. She's 15 for 26 lifetime. Has earned a few more victories on the dirt than the turf overall, but she obviously handles both surfaces. She's run comparable speed figures on each of them. They tried to stretch her out last time in the Tom Benson on that Louisiana Derby Day undercard. I was quite skeptical of her getting the distance that day. I was happy to see her actually go favorite in that race because I was against her. And I've got to say, she actually ran better than I was expecting her to, because I really don't think she wants to go that far. And you could kind of see it in the final furlong. She was just sort of going up and down and was one-paced and couldn't really make up ground on the winner, Delahaye. And I'm not sure about the overall quality of that field. I know it got a huge TimeformUS race rating. I kind of want to see that one backed up a little bit, because I didn't think a whole lot of that field going into the race. Turning back, it makes sense for her. Can she carry that top Fairgrounds form to Keeneland? Well, perhaps. She's taken her show on the road before. For me, Craig, with her, it's just a matter of what kind of price she's going to be. I know she's 8-1 on the line, but a horse that has so many 1s in her PPs and wins so much, I won't be surprised if she takes more money than that.
I won't either. I didn't add up her wins. I'll take your word for it that she's won more on dirt. She's certainly pretty versatile, but I would argue she's better at turf sprinting. I would say that's probably the best part of her game. A lot of her dirt wins have come against Illinois breds in obviously the state of Illinois with lower type speed figures. So I do think this is probably her best surface distance combination. Is she good enough though? I don't think she's going to be 8-1 either. I'd be surprised if she's even as much as 9-2. So I would view her as a contender. I'd probably want her on my tickets if I was playing a pick 5, but she'd be more like a B or C type, probably a C, to be honest.
Another horse in this race that was a difficult call for me, and I ended up taking more of a positive view than I was expecting to when I started to really dive into these horses' past performances and try to formulate how I thought this race was going to come together. And that is the number 12, Love Reigns. And she's a tough one to get a read on, Craig, because on her best day, she clearly has given hints that she could ultimately turn out to be this good. We've primarily seen her competing as a much younger horse. I mean, she came out with a huge performance on debut as a 2-year-old back in April of 2022, winning by nearly 10 lengths on the turf. That in and of itself is something that you don't often see, a horse winning by that margin in a 5.5 furlong turf sprint. I mean, she clearly is really good when she's in form, and I think it's worth noting that she's run some of her best races off layoffs, and we've seen her run some of her best races also at Keeneland. That was the case when she came off the layoff in the Limestone back in April of last year and got the job done by half a length. She got some trouble in the stretch that day. I think the pace worked in her favor. You can see a couple of red color-coded pace figures in the TimeformUS PPs that I've got up on the screen here. But, I mean, you might remember that replay. She had to weave through traffic to get there, and it didn't look like she was going to be able to find the wire about 1/8 of a mile from the finish line. Ultimately did get up, so that was impressive. And you might recall there were some mixed signals from Wesley Ward after that. That was supposed to be her prep for Royal Ascot. Then Ward said that she wasn't training well enough to go to Ascot. We didn't see her for a number of months. She came back in the summer at Saratoga and disappointed despite getting bet down to be even money in that Galway Stakes. And now she's been laid up again for 245 days. I mean, it's another long layoff for her. But like I said, we've seen her come back off layoffs before. And with routine improvement from 3 to 4, if she can improve on those 110 TimeformUS speed figures that she earned as a younger horse, she's a major player in here. Just, do you trust her?
Yeah, I think she's pretty hard to trust. I get the case for her. And the one note I made about her is I think she's a bit of a pace wild card, because I think when she does her best running, she's probably going to be a little bit closer to the pace, even though she had that closing win at Keeneland. Earlier in her career, she showed speed. So she's not going to be for me in this spot. I mean, the post is not great for 5.5, particularly if she doesn't show early speed like we've seen from her in the past. And just when I look at her work tab, it's pretty light for a horse who's only raced basically once in about a year. I'd rather see a little more activity. She's only shows 3 works since then. So I'm going to take a stand against her. I won't be shocked if she wins, but it's just such a deep field. It seems like a tough spot to me.
Yeah, I'm pulling up a stat in DRF Formulator that I wanted to show off for Wesley Ward because I think it fits this filly perfectly, and it kind of swayed me in her direction a little bit. Coming off layoffs like this of 180 days or more in sprint stakes races, and this is any surface, but obviously a large portion of the sample is compiled of turf horses because he's got a lot of those. Over the past 5 years, he's 11 for 25 doing this, 44% win rate with a $3.47 ROI. And when I kind of sort through the winners, you see a lot of turf sprint stakes winners in this sample that have gotten the job done. A lot of them similar prices to what I expect Love Reigns to be in this race. So that makes me scared of her because Wesley Ward, he does this. And Keeneland is a meet that he often points to. And the fact that he's running in a race like this, that he obviously values winning, I think it could be meaningful. The post position, not great. She's going to have to work on a trip under Joel Rosario once again. I did watch one of her workouts coming back for this, and she was going pretty well on March 30th, I think it was the workout that I was watching, with Fandom, a 3-year-old colt who just won the Palisades last week at a price for Wesley Ward. So all of those good signs and those factors kind of led me in the direction of upgrading Love Reigns when I was initially handicapping this race and expecting to be a little bit against her. But if she is indeed in that 6 to 8 to 1 range, she's one that I definitely want to use in this Giants Causeway. Craig, anybody else that you want to mention? Because this is the kind of race where we could basically go through everybody and find something interesting to say about them.
The only other horse I really wanted to talk about, and I am pretty interested in, is a number 2 horse, Bling. She's a horse we haven't yet seen this year. She's a newly turned 4-year-old. She's had some success routing, but what caught my eye was that when she turned back at Keeneland last year to 5.5 in a tough allowance race, she was able to come from off the pace. And she just seems like the type to me that for John Velasquez is going to get a perfect trip sitting on the rail, maybe 4 or 5 lengths off the pace. And if BG Warrior does suddenly pack it in, which is certainly possible, she seems like one to me that has a very good chance to pick up the pieces here. It's not like her speed figures are very far off the others. She showed some really nice ones running 113 and 114, 2 and 3 back on turf. Not going to hold that stint race against her last year, in which BG Warrior finished second in that one, because I just think she's a better turf horse. So she's one that I could be interested in. And based on how we think some of the other horses are going to be a lower price, I could see her actually drifting off that 6-1 morning line.
Yeah, and you could argue that she should be undefeated sprinting on the turf because, I mean, you might remember that Music City from last year. I mean, she had a really tough start that day. I could actually pull up the beginning of that replay. And, I mean, it says she reared at the break. She's off several lengths slowly and actually makes up a ton of ground to ultimately finish third. I mean, that's her all the way on the right of the screen, breaking behind the field. And the fact that she was able to get up for third in a race that, when we take a look at the TimeformUS pace figures for it, has all blue color coded pace figures for that Music City. So, I mean, that was a really good effort for Bling. And like you said, she's run well in recent spots since then. I'm not going to hold that synthetic loss against her. The one negative I found with Bling, Craig, and you can kind of see it when you look in that TimeformUS trainer rating box, her trainer, Vicky Oliver, does not have good stats coming off layoffs like this, just in general. I also looked it up in Formulator, 90 to 180 days. She's only 4 for 63 with a 59-cent ROI. But I don't want to be too negative about that stat. With a horse that I think is going to be a fair price. I mean, we talked about how we think Ouvra is going to get bet down more, how we think that Roses for Deborah is going to get bet down more. And Bling seems like a horse that is actually going to drift up from that 6-1 morning line. And she's drawn a better post position than some others that we've talked about. So I think it made a good case for her. And she was also the other horse that I wanted to bring up because I think that she is kind of the one interesting price horse that I would also want to upgrade in this race.
There's just one more. I don't want to drag this race out too much, but the 7 horse in here, Port Townsend. If I was playing the pick 5, I would want her on my ticket somewhere. I think that maiden win with the 117 speed figure has proven to be pretty darn fast. The horses who have come back out of it, there's been several wins. Horses have matched their speed figures coming out of it. I think the last race was one where it was basically a paid workout. She was even money that day. I'm not sure why. She could have been 2 to 5. That's how strong she looked in that field to me. They changed her tactics up a little bit, and she just kind of was outside the horses late. And I think she's actually pretty good. Now, this is a big step up in the stakes company, looking for just her 3rd win, but I'd want her on my ticket somewhere.
Yeah, it's a funny discussion about that 117 TimeformUS speed figure for her maiden win, because it's a tricky speed figure to make, and you could see it when you look in the charts, and I'll click into the TimeformUS charts for people to see. I mean, it's one of these days where there were only, I think, 4 turf races at fairgrounds, and I recall that I think there was just 1 sprint, or maybe there were 2 sprints on the card, and days like this where you don't have that much to compare it to, you kind of have to do a little bit of guesswork to see if the sprints played the same way that the routes did. And if there are only 2 of them or 3 and 1, it's hard to really be sure. And, this is kind of a pivotal race, Craig, because you made a different decision from Beyer about this particular race. I think Beyer had it 31 points lower than you. And a lot of these horses that competed in this Port Townsend race have since come back and run against each other again on days where there was only 1 sprint race. And you as you would do as a speed figure, you kind of had to project that sprint race based on what these fillies had already run. So you have this whole group of fillies in this race consistently running speed figures that are 10 to 12 points higher than what Beyer does for all of these same horses for like a series of 3 races. And it's just kind of interesting. We haven't really gotten answers about who's right yet because they keep running against each other. I think we'll maybe find out a little bit here, but maybe not, because I think this is a tough spot for a horse like Port Townsend. I would go a little bit more off that last number. I didn't think a whole lot of the field she beat, and I think she's going to have to really step up, but she's a big price if you believe in the number 2 back. Well, let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, race 8. It's over to the dirt course. This is an optional claiming 100,000. Non-winners of 3 other than is the allowance condition. And there are some horses in here in for the $100,000 tag, I should note, and we'll mention them as we go through. The distance is 1 mile and a 16th. That means there's the short stretch run at Keeneland. And Craig, I found this to be a problematic race for the pick 5 because I think there's a horse that you sort of have to make a decision about how much you want to lean on him or if you want to be against him. And that is the morning line favorite, the number 7 Classic Catch. And he's probably where we should dive in talking about the contenders. But if you get past Classic Catch, if you don't like Classic Catch, this is a really muddled group that's hard to sift through because a lot of them are not in the best form. They all kind of look the same at their best from a speed figure standpoint, but their best days may be behind them. And also, there is quite a bit of pace in this field, and I'll switch on over to this race for those watching on YouTube, and we'll look at the TimeformUS pace projector. I mean, one thing that does appear to make Classic Catch pretty dangerous, and we'll kind of feed into the discussion of him, is that he is supposed to get the right kind of trip from off the pace.
Yes, he is. And I know he's a horse that we talked about a bit last year. And I think Todd Pletcher really wanted to get him on turf. And when he finally did, it didn't really work out. Now, he ran into a very strong group that day in Integration, who I believe is running Friday at Keeneland. And I'm Very Busy, who's going on to have a lot of success this year already and maybe one of the leading horses in the division. So I don't want to hold that against him too much. But I do worry that his 2 best races are races that were in off-the-turf contest, one at Aqueduct, one at Saratoga. Those are the races with his best figures. And, yeah, I'm really torn on him. And I thought this was going to be a race when I saw the field size. And there's even an entry in here, which surprised me. I didn't know they had entries at Keeneland. I can't remember seeing one anytime recently, but clearly they can. Same trainer, same owner, so I get it. But yeah, there's not a lot of alternatives that you can just latch onto and fall in love with, in my opinion. All these horses have a lot of questions, so it's a pretty open race for me. I don't love Classic Catch in here, but it's not like I'm going to sit here and make a huge case against them because the others in here I don't fall in love with them either.
Yeah, and we should say one half of that entry, I think you could expect to scratch. They both have the same jockey named Martin Garcia. I don't know the rules at Keeneland if one of them is mandated to have to scratch or if one could be a late jockey switch. I don't know exactly how that works, but their horses going out for the similar connection or the same connections that seemingly have similar running styles. They both want to be forwardly placed, Giant Game and Howling Time. So it feels like one of them is likely to scratch. Giant Game is cross-entered in a race on Thursday, but he's an MTO in a turf race, so he's only going to run if that race comes off the turf. I guess we'll see how much rain comes between now and recording this on Wednesday afternoon and Thursday. But as for my opinion of Classic Catch, I got why they tried the turf last time. Todd Pletcher had been wanting to try the turf with him. He's a horse who has an action that looks like he might actually handle the turf, and he had worked on it, I believe, last summer at Saratoga. Okay. It just didn't work out, and it turns out he's just a dirt horse, and he's run really well on the dirt a number of times. He was maybe a little bit of a disappointment through the Triple Crown prep races. They tried him in the Wood Memorial. He didn't run so well, and then through the summer, he was disappointed in a couple of spots at relatively short prices, but he ran a big figure closing into, or I should say on top of a moderate pace going the 1.25 mile distance at Saratoga. And then his most recent dirt race in that off the turf Jockey Club Derby, I mean, he had some trouble at the start that day. That was a race where he kind of broke a little bit slowly and then got squeezed between horses and wound up a little further back than I think the connections really wanted him to be. He had shown that good tactical speed in the prior start when they took the blinkers off. And in this other 1.25 mile race that we're taking a look at that here, the Jockey Club Derby. He was just never able to get forward after getting bounced around between rivals like that at the start of the race. And he stayed on well enough to get up for second. Another nice speed figure for him. Those kinds of numbers, I mean, they just make him one of the horses to beat in here. And he's arguably in better form if you're able to look past that turf race than a lot of others in this field. And the one thing that I really liked to see from Classic Catch, Craig, was when I looked up his workouts for this return race. We already know Todd Pletcher can do well off layoffs and, get these horses fit from workouts, but I really liked what I saw watching them because he has been the workmate of Tapit Trice, that good 3-year-old from last year who placed in, I want to say, the Belmont and the Travers. I mean, he, raced in a lot of those top races and, was a horse who often had trouble sealing the deal and getting the job done, but obviously was a very high class. And Classic Catch has been the workmate of Tapit Trice, I think, 4 times in the month of March. I watched 3 of those workouts, and he was best, and I would say clearly best over Tapit Trice on all 3 of the occasions that I watched. And I don't recall Classic Catch being this fantastic workhorse in the morning. I think this is somewhat of a new development with him, that he just seems to really be thriving coming into this race. So that gives me a little bit of confidence that he's going to show up. And also Todd Pletcher, like I said, he's got good numbers doing this. Just to be specific, I looked them up in Formulator. 4-year-old and up, 120 to 240 day layoffs in dirt route allowance races specifically. He's 9 for 22, 41% with an ROI that hovers just under $2. So makes sense for a horse like this. It's going to be a short price. It fits him pretty well. And I just kind of trust him to show up in a race where I have major question marks about everybody else, Craig. And it sounds like maybe you're a little bit more negative on Classic Catch than I am, though not totally negative. So, I mean, I guess you have some idea of somebody else you want to highlight in this race. I'm not sure who it's going to be, so I'll throw it back to you.
No, if I was going to play this, I would use probably 3 horses, and Classic Catch would be one of them. I also have concerns about the distance. You noted his 2 good races came at 1.25 miles. I would say 1 mile at a 16th at Keeneland is vastly different than that, though the workouts give me a little pause that maybe he's just better as a 4-year-old. We haven't seen him in a while, and it's certainly possible he's a new horse or a better horse at this point. So I wouldn't totally dismiss him. If I had to look at some other options, they would be the horses that are drawn inside, and we don't even know if one of them is going to run. The 2-horse Transact, he ran some good races on the dirt last year. He ran speed figures that would be competitive. He's another 4-year-old. His return race was in a synthetic stakes at Turfway. Surly Furious ran off, won that one by over 8 lengths. I don't want to hold it against him too much, but I don't want to give him a free pass because he's a horse who's ran fine on synthetic. He started his career with 2 wins on synthetic. He's also a horse we saw win first time out, so I don't want to give him a total pass because that was the first race off a layoff. He's shown he could run first out, so he definitely has some question marks. He's shown on a lone lead, so I won't be surprised if he likes Keeneland. We'll know by this point how the track is playing. I do think that's important at Keeneland. I thought the first week of racing was very fair, but you never know when that could change. The other horse, I mean, I think you have to consider pretty seriously if he shows up as the 1-horse Giant Game. His speed figures fit. He ran a good second in an allowance to Gasoline. He didn't run very well in the Clark, but he was pressing a really fast pace that day. He's a horse who's shown plenty of talent, taken necessary class relief. So I don't know that he's actually going to be 6-1, but if he shows up, and maybe that's a pretty big if for him, but if he does, I think he's got a big shot as well. So those would be the 3 for me. The others all have pretty serious question marks, I think, and haven't really shown the ability to win a race like this.
Yeah, I'll cut Nick some slack on this one. It is tough to make a morning line when you've got an entry and one half is coming out. You don't want to go too much in one direction or the other. I think Howling Time would be maybe twice the price, and maybe Giant Game would be a little lower than 6-1. So we'll see how that plays out. But Giant Game is clearly the stronger half of that Dale Romans entry. And like you said, I mean, he's got prior races that would make him really tough in here. The turf experiment, I get it. I mean, I think we talked about it when we were handicapping a race at Tampa where he was entered for turf, or maybe it was Gulfstream, I forget exactly. And I was somewhat interested in him getting on the turf because he's got pedigree for it. Didn't work out. Now they're going to go back to the dirt with him. He's even entered as a dirt horse in that turf race on Thursday. So if he can get back to his prior form, he's a major player. The trip is a little bit of a question because when you watch a lot of his races, Craig, he's not exactly one that, at least recently, has been passing horses. So the position that he gets going into the clubhouse turn, I'm not sure he's going to exactly be able to improve on it. But he obviously does have the quality to be a major player in this race if he's able to get the trip. And I, too, was most interested in Transect as the main alternative. And, if I had to predict how this race was going to get bet, I think we're going to see a bigger gap in the odds between Transect and Classic Catch. I'm not going to be surprised if Classic Catch is more in the 6-5 to 7-5 range. And if Transect is, he could be second choice. I'm not going to be surprised if he's third choice, but maybe more like a 9-2 shot. We'll see how that plays out. But he does have form from last year that would make him really tough in here. His Ellis Park Derby, I thought, was an excellent effort. I mean, that was a time when we saw a lot of horses that were riding the rail at Ellis do well. I don't have notes on that exact day, August 13th, that was a rail bias day. It didn't exactly play out that way, but for what it's worth, Transect was 3 wide early, made that move to the lead, and I thought he battled back pretty gamely when Tumbarumba passed him. I mean, it's almost impossible to fend off Tumbarumba in the stretch when he's involved in a duel with you because he almost always beats you. But Transect was game to be second in there, and if I could have confidence he'd get back to that form, it would be an easy choice for me to pick him over Classic Catch. The synthetic race bothers me a little bit because he did handle it early in his career. And, I know he didn't earn fast speed figures when he tried it back in the beginning of his 3-year-old season, but at least he won those races and looked like he was traveling well over the surface, showed better speed over the surface. And, the chart comments at Turfway are a joke. I mean, it's they might as well not have a chart caller because they're totally meaningless. But I mean, and you can see I actually put in a note in my TimeformUS and DRF past performances, just for the trip of this horse, because I mean, stuff gets missed all the time at Turfway, and this horse did have real trouble at the start of that last race. He kind of got squeezed between horses back to last, and from there could never really get competitive. And maybe Transect is just the kind of horse that isn't really going to pass anybody, and you need to get forward with him. And he's a grinding type that when he gets challenged, he'll try to respond to it. But he doesn't strike me as one of those horses that's going to make a big run from the back of the pack. So with the blinkers going on, I think the connections sort of feel that too. Putting Louis Saez on, it's kind of a signal that they want to ride this horse aggressively from the inside. And if they do, I could see him getting Brave up front, and I think that's his best chance.
Yeah, no argument with that, and that's a good catch. David with the fire with the Turfway chart comments. The only other thing I wanted to mention was the 4-horse Brigadier General, not because I particularly like him, but because as an ex-military guy, I was just going to drop a little knowledge that a Brigadier General is a 1-star general.
Well, I did not know that, Craig, so I'm a little more educated on that now. And I mean, I will say the horse Brigadier General, he's got that 1 speed figure from Keeneland going 2 turns in October of last year that would probably put him in the winner's circle in this field. That 121 where he set an honest pace and was able to hold on. And it's not like that was some merry-go-round. The race was kind of falling apart behind him. War Campaign, who was second, he's a closer. So, I mean, if I had confidence that that Brigadier General would show up with that race, I think he'd be a serious player in here. It's just, he's a little hard to like off his 2 efforts since then, and I wonder if he's going in the wrong direction. And that's just a question that I've got about a lot of these is their current form.
Yeah, and the thing with that, it's one of those off-the-turf races, and as a speed figure maker, they're just one of the biggest pain in the butts in the world because they always seem to come up faster than the horses are able to run back to.
Yeah, and I mean, there are others that we could have talked about that we're not going to mention. I mean, I'm not a fan of Frosted Departure. He's a need-the-lead type, and I don't think he's quick enough to get to the front, as the pace projector would indicate. Gilcrease is one that's short on the morning line. I think he's more of a sprinter. He's going to be trying to stretch out, but those horses were not for me, and Craig didn't mention them, and I gave you ample opportunity, so I don't think you are fans of those either, Craig.
No.
Let's move on to the feature race on this Saturday card at Keeneland. Race 9, it is the Grade 1 Jenny Wiley going 1 mile and the 16th on the turf for the fillies and mares. And this seems to draw a high-quality field every single year, Craig, and no different with this Jenny Wiley group. 10 runners are signed on. Our colleague Marcus Hirsch reports that Star Fortress is not a certain runner in this race. I would imagine that Cherie DeVoe and the Connections took a look at how this field came up and said, maybe there's a better spot out there for Star Fortress. But I mean, the typical firepower that we see from the Chad Brown stable, it is in this field. I mean, we've got top contenders from his barn like Gina Romantica, Surge Capacity, Fluffy Socks. I think he's got a total of 4 in here, but Cachet is his as well. But maybe we should start the conversation, Craig, with a trainer that's always dangerous when he ships over, and that, of course, is Charlie Appleby, who's got the number 5, English Rose. And what do you do with this horse coming in from from Meydan? She was competing over in Dubai. She started her career in England, but she's 3 for 4 in her career, has done very little wrong. It seems like she's taken a massive step forward with each and every start. And when Charlie Appleby brings these types over, the ones that seem a little bit underexposed, it feels like they typically do show up.
Yeah, I know what I'm going to do, and that's put her in the A slot if I play a pick 5, because, when these kind come over, they run. I mean, he lost a few races last weekend. I didn't really like any of those horses. I think it's pretty notable that he brings Bill Buick over to ride this one. We didn't see him last weekend. That indicates to me that he's serious with this one, and I imagine he's riding some other horses this weekend as well. I haven't looked ahead yet, but I imagine this filly is going to fit really well. She's a 4-year-old. Her time form ratings probably look a little bit light compared to some of the speed figures, but I'm always just a little bit leery for lightly raced horses of trying to compare those directly. And I think she's going to be a very serious contender. And that's saying something, because there are some really strong fillies and mares in this group.
Yeah, I was checking out some of the time form notes for her, which gave great insight into the overseas races, especially in England, Ireland, and even they're available for some of these Meydan cards. And she's just a horse, and I watched all of her races to get a sense of her. She seems like she's been learning with every start, and that's something that you want to see from these lightly raced horses. She was a little bit over enthusiastic on debut. She broke slowly in that first race at Newmarket and just seemed like she wanted to run off every step of the way. And the jockey, who I'm actually not that familiar with, I mean, did a good job just keeping a lid on her and producing her when he actually wanted to, as opposed to when it seemed like the filly wanted to. She was much more professional, and William Buick got aboard in that second race at Kempton. And then her last 2 races, both at Meydan this winter, I don't think that the horses that she faced in the Cape Verde or the Balanchine were the toughest that she could have encountered maybe in a similar Group 2 race in Europe, or even that she's going to meet here. But I still liked what I saw from her both times. In that race 2 back, her lone loss, she was kind of jostled at the beginning of the race. So she was actually jostling with another Godolphin horse, I think, her actually a stablemate, and just didn't seem totally comfortable. Again, kind of like the debut race, she seemed like she wanted to run off, and it was a tough time for William Buick to keep her behind horses, but eventually she settled and she produced a kick and was just turned away by a horse that got the jump on her. But last time out, it seemed like she took that mental step forward. She settled better, and she got produced in mid-stretch, traveled really well to that point. And once he asked her, I mean, she settled that race quite quickly and put that field away nicely to win comfortably in the end. I just get the sense, the long story short, she's really good, and we're likely to see another step forward from her. And I actually think if she is around 9-2, which she is in the morning line, that's a fair price. And I'll be interested to see how they bet her, Craig, because there are Chad Brown horses in this race that are supposed to take money. I mean, I think Nick's got it right that Gina Romantica probably is going to be the favorite in this race. I mean, how could you knock her last 2 performances? Huge TimeformUS speed figures. I mean, beat one of the horses that was vying for a championship last year in Italian when she won the First Lady over this course. And it should be noted that 2 of Gina Romantica's biggest victories have been achieved over this Keeneland turf course. And even in the Breeders' Cup Mile, I personally thought that 7-1 was bad value on her that day. I thought she was a little bit overmatched, and she ran really well to finish 4th, just beating the length.
Yeah, it's just beaten a length by some really good horses. Master of the Seas, who I think is back on Friday. Maj, who is obviously very good. Casa Creed. No knock. She won the First Lady over this course last year, and she's just been a filly who's been very good. Well, now she's a mare in her first start this year, but you can't blame anybody. I would assume she'll be one of the favorites, if not the favorite, and she's really good. So if you're trying to beat her, you better have your running shoes on it. So it's not going to be any walkover for English Rose. And I would say the same thing applies to Didia, who's just been in razor sharp form. She's run really well for a long time. Her only real not great effort was in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf at 1.25 miles against just really tough competition with Inspiral and Warm Heart in there. So I'm not going to hold that against her. She's a filly or mare now who runs 125 TimeformUS speed figure. So she fits as well. And it's for all the others in here. I mean, there's a lot of good horses. Even if Star Fortress doesn't go, that leaves 9 horses. You could probably make a legitimate case for 8 of the fillies and mares in here, but it just seems like a really strong field to me. And I would have a hard time seeing anybody beat all 3 of those horses.
Yeah, they are a tough trio. I mean, among them, I guess, speaking about the 2 US-based horses and Gina Romantica and Didia that we just discussed, I mean, Gina Romantica showed up in the Breeders' Cup, whereas Didia kind of threw in a clunker that day. And maybe you want to give her that excuse, even though she has handled 1.25 miles. And with Didia, she has shown up consistently. I wouldn't say that she's necessarily proven herself against a field like this, even though she's gotten some of those speed figures that put her in the same conversation or the same tier as a runner like Gina Romantica. She hasn't beaten those others that are vying for the top of the division or the championships or the best horses in the Chad Brown barn. I mean, she ran pretty well in the New York last year, but market segmentation is maybe the 6th or 7th best turf horse in Chad Brown's barn among the fillies and mares. So I think the Didia does have some things to prove from a class standpoint in this race, but you do have to respect her reliability in these races. I mean, she just works out good trips for herself and seems to show up. And my one knock against Regina Romantica, just given the fact that she is likely to be a short price, Craig, is that she could not have gotten more perfect trips in those last 2 races. I mean, you remember the First Lady, Tyler Gaffalione just did everything right. That perfect inside-out trip, saving ground around the turns and angling out once they got to the straightaway. And same thing in the Breeders' Cup. I mean, just did everything right, saving ground around both turns and bumped his way out of the top of the stretch. It was like a perfect Irad Ortiz impersonation from Tyler in that race. And you found room for her. And ultimately, she just wasn't good enough. I mean, she got outclosed by Master of the Seas, who just zoomed right past her in the final 8th mile, but no disgrace there. He's one of the fastest finishers in the world. So she's a really nice horse. I just wonder what would happen if she doesn't get as perfect a trip as she's gotten in her last couple of starts. And I think that should bring us to a discussion of the pace projector, Craig, because this is a tricky one. And it makes this an even more difficult race to handicap because you've got the dreaded no speed designation here. And when you look through this field, I understand that because there really aren't confirmed frontrunners in this race, really outside of the number 1 Walkathon, who kind of keeps going back and forth between leading in her races and coming from way off the pace. So she's kind of fooling the pace projector a little bit, who doesn't exactly have her as a speed or a leader type. It has her kind of splitting the difference. Her label is a mid-pack because sometimes she's a front runner, sometimes she's a closer. I would expect this time that Ian Wilkes is going to send her to the front with Julian Leperoux aboard, especially drawing the rail. I don't think she's good enough to beat a field like this, even with a perfect trip, but I more wonder who's going to get that first run on her and who's going to be slotted in the right spots and behind her.
Yeah, that's a good call on the pace projector. We probably should have mentioned that from the outset. I would assume Walkathon is going to go to the front, though, with Julien Leperoux. That's, who really knows? I can never figure out what he's going to do, but it almost seems like she has to lead by default in here. You can see surge capacity is shown second on the pace projector. She's never really shown speed in her life. Her best races, like in the Valley View, she was more of a pace tracker towards a little bit toward the front, but not really a front runner. And I doubt Chad Brown is going to tell Joe Rosario to go to the front. Maybe he will to ensure pace since he has so many runners in here, but it's definitely an iffy pace scenario. And the reason we use that designation is because we don't want to trick people into thinking that these kind of races favor front runners, because generally they don't. What happens is somebody sets the lead, they go kind of slow, they keep all the closers in it, and the best finishers typically win. Obviously, nothing is 100%. sometimes somebody will steal it, but in a race like this, I'm going to stick with the horses who are going to finish the strongest. And I think that's the particularly Gina Romantica and English Rose for Charlie Appleby. I mean, there are some other horses in here with talent. Walkathon, it seems like she outruns her odds every time, but this is a much deeper field than what we've seen. Fluffy Socks is one who she certainly has the ability to win, but she just hardly ever wins. I think she's won for her last 14 or 15. Elusive Princess is coming out of that Hillsborough Stakes, same race as Fluffy Socks was in. There was absolutely no pace. That was a comical pace that day where Sparkle Blue was able to hold on, but she's shown a good finishing kick in the past. But in the end, I'm just going to go with the classiest fillies and mares in here, and particularly English Rose. I just think she's going to be really strong.
Yeah, I also think the English Rose is the most likely winner, but I do want to discuss some others, Craig. I mean, you touched upon the potential speed that Surge Capacity could show, and she does have, that race once upon a time that would put her on the front end in here. And I kind of wonder what they're going to do with her, because when Chad Brown enters 4 horses, he does typically try to have some plan with how they're going to ride and how his jockeys are going to position them early. It's typically not to help one over the other, but he just wants to have a variety of different trips so that they're not all jockeying for the exact same position during the race. And you would imagine if he's going to instruct one of them to go towards the front, it would be Surge Capacity. And Joel Rosario, of all the jockeys in here, is the one that can sometimes put forth a surprising ride. And, it wouldn't be shocking to see him send this filly to the front. She's got real talent. I mean, she had trouble at the top of the stretch in both the Valley View and the Matriarch and was still able to overcome it to win. I mean, especially in the Valley View, Joel, I thought, made a bit of an error when he tried to go inside of a tiring horse, got stopped, had to alter course to the outside, and she just produced this electrifying rally to get up and win anyway. And then last time in the Matriarch, she had very good position on the racetrack for almost the entire race. I mean, towards the inside, but coming around that the far turn, again, he tried to stay towards the inside, and we're going to show the replay here. I mean, she's the horse from the Klarovich Silks on the rail behind the gray horse, and has to pause briefly trying to go inside of that one, and it seems like he's not going to get there, especially based on how short that stretch of Del Mar is. But once she finds that seam, she just produces this electrifying turn of foot to get up and get the job done. When she's able to find that daylight in the final eighth, she is really tough to hold off. And watching this replay of the Matriarch, I also want to mention another horse in here, the other Chad Brown runner towards the outside, the number 10, But Cachet. I mean, she was also in here, and I didn't think she had the most perfect trip in the Matriarch. She kind of got stopped when she was making her run in mid-stretch, and maybe she just wasn't quite quick enough to get into the hole that she was going for under Umberto Rispoli, but she did lose significant momentum, even a little bit after Surge Capacity was finding that space towards the inside to unleash her run. And it wasn't really until inside the final eighth that But Cachet was totally clear. And she was finishing up really nicely to get up for third in a race where in mid-stretch, it looked like she was going to be out of the superfecta. So she really finished well that day. And when you look through But Cachet's past performances, it's not the first. This won't be the first time that she's encountered some blue color-coded TimeformUS pace figures, if we indeed get those in this race. Because she's a horse that is accustomed to racing in slow-paced races, and on occasion she can be more forwardly placed. And she is one that, when you watch her replays, does have a tendency to get a little bit keen. So I wouldn't be surprised if she's one that Chad Brown says to Frankie Dettori, hey, this horse, maybe she needs a little help to beat some of my others in here. Why don't we just take a shot and send her to the front? She can be a little keen on occasion. She's drew the outside post rather than got hung out wide every step of the way. Let's just go to the lead and Frankie take a shot by wiring the field. I won't be surprised if that's the plan with But Cachet. I'm not saying that she's a rabbit in this race. Chad Brown doesn't typically start traditional rabbits. Often his horses that lead have a chance to actually hold on. But she's one that I could see him using in that fashion. And she's got quality. I mean, she's run speed figures that put her in the mix before, and she can unleash a strong finish. So of the Chad Brown runners, I think But Cachet is going to offer the best value of all of them. And she's not as likely to win the race as Gina Romantica, but she's the kind of horse that I would be way more likely to bet than Gina Romantica, and I would want to upgrade her in my pick 5 for that reason.
Yeah, I think my one concern is that matriarch. I don't know how strong that race was. I think it was one that turned out to be a Chad Brown Invitational. I think he had maybe even the superfecta, if I remember right. And it was just a case where he shipped kind of a second string out west. But as you say, the speed figures match up. I can see taking a shot. Me personally, I'm going to stick with the main three that I talked about. But I can't blame anybody for trying to get enterprising in here because the pace is pretty much a total wild card, and crazy things happen when if they post a 50, which I think is not out of the question in a race like this.
Yeah, with Surge Capacity, who we already touched upon a little bit. One thing I want to note with her, and it might mean nothing, is I did watch one of her workouts coming back for this, and she did this like weird thing approaching the wire in the workout where she was like throwing her head up a little bit or carrying her head. Like she's a horse that has high head carriage naturally, but she just looked a little uncomfortable at the end of the workout, and it's not something I recall seeing from her in her races in the past. So it's just something to consider with her. Maybe it means nothing, but when you're talking about short prices, you want to take note of even minor flaws with horses like this. So was just thinking about that as I was going through this race. We could talk ad nauseum about everybody in this field, Craig. It's another one of those races. I mean, one horse that you touched upon that I just wanted to mention briefly was the 3 Elusive Princess. She's another that's got that tactical speed where I could see her being a little more forward. She had that opportunity last time where I think she was shown leading on the pace projector after the scratch of market segmentation in that Hillsborough, and they came out with a clear plan to rate her, and it didn't work out at all. I think they'd be wiser to make better use of her tactical speed here. I just know Junior Alvarado is not that kind of rider, and maybe these are not connections that have interest in going to the front end, and it could be to this horse's detriment. But even if she gets that right kind of trip, I don't know if I believe she's quite good enough, but I could see her being a big price in this race. I won't be surprised if she's in the double-digit odds range, just given how much depth of talent there is in this Jenny Wiley. So it's a tough affair to handicap, but I think we're landing on similar pages. We both agree that English Rose is very dangerous, and we're considering some of those Chad Brown runners. For me, I'd be looking to upgrade But Cachet above some of the others. Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence. The last stakes on this card is race 10. It is the grade 3 Lexington, this one going the mile and the 16th distance on the turf for 3-year-olds. And it's kind of the last opportunity to get into the Kentucky Derby starting gate for a few horses, particularly the number 5 Hades, who was supposed to punch his Kentucky Derby ticket in the Florida Derby. Things didn't work out. He settled for 5th, a distant 5th behind Fierceness. And I know that the connections were a little disappointed with the trip that he got, and they're going to try one more time to get those points. And I think Hades is the one horse that can guarantee a spot at the Kentucky Derby starting gate if he wins this race. Maybe even if he finishes second, he'll have enough points to get in. So kind of bear that in mind as you're handicapping and what these horses have to get out of this race. But putting aside the Derby implications, Craig, this is still an interesting race to handicap because you've got some horses that are returning to that good 2-year-old form, like the Wine Steward. And then you've got these 3-year-olds that ran through the Derby preps that are going to try to get one last good effort out of them in the springtime.
Yeah, I mean, this is still a pretty valuable race in its own right, being $400,000. So as far as Hades goes, I'm just going to say good luck. I was not a fan of this horse in the Florida Derby. They're going to come back in just 2 weeks as kind of an afterthought, I'm sure. And I generally try to avoid these horses. He's a horse who has not been particularly quick. He ran with some favorable pace scenarios when he won the Holy Bull, same when he won an overmatched Florida Bred Allowance race. And I'm always going to try to beat a horse like this. I would be surprised if he's not the favorite again. I'm not trying to pick on Nick Tamaro. I can't even imagine how difficult it is to make a morning line for Keeneland, where horses are coming from all over the country, different surfaces like we have in this one. So when I say those kind of things, it's just how I'm looking ahead to see the race. But I would think Hades is probably going to be the favorite. I get the case for the Wine Steward as well, but yeah, as far as Hades goes, he's not for me in here, so I'm going to try to beat him.
Yeah, I'm more positive on Hades than you are, Craig. I mean, I was at the Florida Derby as well, and I obviously was disappointed in his performance that day, but it's kind of fitting that the two horses that are going to take one more shot to get in the Derby are Hades and Liberal Arts, because they had to be two of the most frustrating watches for their connections in their final round prep races, because you could tell that Hades and Liberal Arts had no chance in their respective races by the time they got out of the clubhouse turn. I mean, things had just gone wrong from a trip standpoint for both of them by that point in the race. And with Hades, it was being unable to get that forward position. And I think we know at this point, to run his better races, Hades needs to get in front of horses. He doesn't want to take that kickback. He wants to maybe not be setting a slow pace like he was in those two victories, but he's got to be somewhere forward to be in the mix. And he just was never able to get that position in the Florida Derby. I mean, Fierceness just naturally faster than him, but also breaking from the inside. They head right into that clubhouse turn at Gulfstream. There's very little straightaway before you hit the turn. And Paco Lopez tried to hustle him forward, got this horse going, but then horses came over on him. He was keen, rank, had to steady back, and just wound up further back than he wanted to be. And just, you could see the horse was unhappy where he was in mid-pack and just lost position after that. And on the turn, it looked like Hades was going to be eased and finish last. And it's actually a credit to him that he beat half the field and finished fifth. I know he was a mile behind Fierceness, but he at least showed some heart to come back on and finish fifth in that race. I do think this horse has ability. I know he had everything go his own way in that Holy Bull Triumph. I still like the way he finished. I think distance is fine for this horse. And there's a rider switch for this race to Jose Ortiz, who's softer hands, I think, might suit Hades a little better than the hustling ride that Paco gave him last time. And based on the pace projector, which I have up on screen here, and I'll make it a little bit bigger, he's not supposed to have as much trouble getting forward in this race. And even with all of those blue color coded pace figures, he's still showing somewhat forward on the pace projector, only behind the 10 Lucky Jeremy, who I do think is going to be in front. I mean, seems like the clear front runner in this field. So I think Hades is going to have a better opportunity to get the right trip in this race. It's just a question of how good you think he is. I think he's a better horse than you do, Craig, but I agree. I don't love the desperation of running back in 2 weeks just to try to get those points. I think horses that have tried to do this in the past have had some success doing it, trying to get into the Derby. I mean, we've seen some horses use the Lexington to springboard into the Derby, even though they're coming off short rest. So I think sometimes these 3-year-olds having the foundation, it can set them up for success in the Lexington, but still, I'd want a decent price on Hades. 7-2 is probably as low as I'd want to go on him. And we should mention, while we're talking about him, the other horse coming back on short rest, Liberal Arts. Are you a little more positive on him, Craig? Because, I mean, he really just got totally eliminated in the clubhouse turn of that Arkansas Derby. It was kind of his own doing because he got really rank, and I don't remember seeing that from this horse in the past. He just refused to settle under Tyler Gaffalione. He sort of chirped to him coming out of the starting gate to get a bit of position, and then the horse tried to run off with him, and he lugged out so badly onto the backstretch. And there was a point with about 6 furlongs to go where I thought Liberal Arts was going to get eased and just not even complete the race. But I mean, he sort of dragged Tyler back into it and ran on okay to be sixth, kind of like Hades, not a factor, but at least credit to him for passing a few horses and getting a decent speed figure. He's got to run a more professional race here, but I do think Liberal Arts has talent.
I do as well. And that last race was just a complete mess. And a lot of it was his own doing, as you say. I think he was actually disqualified from 6 to wherever, somewhere down below that. But at least he has better speed figures on TimeformUS than Hades. Maybe not necessarily final time figures, but I give him, I guess, a little more of a shot just because of price. Don't particularly love him either, though, based on that effort. It also seems like a kind of desperate act to run him back in 2 weeks. And generally, I just don't like these horses. I liked them in the Arkansas Derby and was pretty disappointed in how that turned out. So I'm going to look at a couple different horses if I play this race vertically. Not sure that the Wine Steward's going to be any value. I wanted to be against him when I first started looking at this race, but I dug in the Mike Maker stats and I didn't print them out, but I was actually pretty surprised when I started looking up coming off 180-day layoff. And then I narrowed it down to dirt. Then I narrowed it down to routes. And they just kept being good stats. They were all good win percentage, good ROI. And as I dug further, I finally got down to graded stakes, and he didn't have any runners that met the criteria. So maybe you'd want to hold that against him. But the one thing I can say is he can bring a horse back to go 2 turns on the dirt. It was pretty clear in the formulator stats. So no real knocks against him, other than he's probably not going to offer any value as the morning line favorite. And you mentioned Lucky Jeremy, who's shown on the front in this race, and I actually think he might be pretty good. He comes out of a decent third behind Stronghold that was 2 back in the Sunland Derby. We've already seen Sunland come back to win the Santa Anita Derby over that Bob Baffert heavy favorite that day. And it's a race where some other horses have come back to show that number is probably pretty legit from that race. And it actually stacks up pretty nicely in this field. His speed figures fit. I'm not going to hold that Jeff Ruby stakes against him. And I actually think he ran pretty well that day, facing pressure in what was a pretty quick pace. One of the fractions, the half mile, almost hit the 140 mark when he was being pressured. And he was only beaten 4 1/4 lengths, and most notably, endlessly won that race by 4 lengths. So he was in a really close photo. He could have easily been second in that race. So I think Lucky Jeremy's a horse who might get overlooked, and I'm pretty interested in betting him in here.
Yeah, no, I think you make a pretty good case for Lucky Jeremy. I didn't think a whole lot of that Sunland Park Derby at the time, but I mean, in retrospect, it's aged well. I mean, the winner, Stronghold, obviously came back to win the Santa Anita Derby, and somewhat shockingly, the 4th place finisher in that Sunland Park Derby came back to finish 4th in the Santa Anita Derby, that huge long shot Curlin's Chaos. So, I mean, it does hold up pretty well when it stands up to scrutiny. And Lucky Jeremy came back to run that comparable speed figure in the Jeff Ruby. So he makes sense in here. And as we scroll back up to look at the TimeformUS pace projector, he is just shown all alone up front. And I think that's going to make him really dangerous because I don't know who else in this field is going to go with him and Craig. I mean, the Wine Steward has sprint speed and he's, stalked the pace in those races, but he's not a front runner. And I can't imagine the instructions are going to be from Mike Maker to, be hell-bent on getting forward coming off this long layoff. They probably want to ride this horse more conservatively. And there are some others that have shown speed in sprint races like, the Long Shot, the 6, How's Your Attitude, maybe the 7, Ever Do It. I mean, he's shown speed on occasion, but recently they've been more mid-pack types. So I think Lucky Jeremy is going to go to the front in here, and he might be pretty tough to get by, and I do believe he'll be a decent price in this race. He's 8-1 in the morning line. I could see him being somewhere in the 6 to 8-1 range, and that's probably a fair price on him. And he's a horse that when I first handicapped this race, I viewed him as a fringe player, a contender. But as we talk about it a little more, Craig, and I'm taking a deeper look at this pace projector, he does make a lot of sense in here, and I think he's one that I'm going to have to upgrade a little bit from what I was initially planning to do in this race.
Yeah, I always like to look at the horses who were shown in behind in the pace projector. And as you note, it's a pretty big gap. And I see Hades who, he has tactical speed, but the one time he was in that fast-paced race, it didn't go well. Now, I think some of that was the break, but he might be put in that unenviable position of chasing a horse like Lucky Jeremy as well. So not a huge fan of that. And when I see How's Your Attitude, who didn't even show a ton of speed on synthetic surfaces, I just can see a race where he's all by himself. The Wine Steward, I think, is the real big question mark, because if he runs back to that Breeders' Futurity we saw where he was a narrow loser to Locked, who obviously was one of the better 2-year-olds in the country last year. I mean, that just makes him a huge player, but it's just one of those, what kind of trips he going to get? How far back is he going to get shuffled? And is he worth the 5-2? I don't think he is personally, but if I was playing a pick 5, I would use him pretty prominently.
Yeah, I mean, you'll recall, Craig, Locked ran so much better than the Wine Steward that day. I mean, Locked was 5 wide around the far turn to make that move to win. So there was a half length between them at the end. I think Locked was more than a half length superior to the Wine Steward, but still, the Wine Steward was game and defeat, and he handled that first 2-turn test. I just generally don't like taking horses such as this at short prices, and we'll see what kind of price he is. I don't know if he's actually going to be the favorite in this race. This is a hard race to make a morning line for, and I'm not exactly sure how they're going to bet it. But anything under 9-2, I think would be a little short for me on the Wine Steward, just given the questions he has to answer coming back after all this time, because it's not like it was the plan for the wine steward to miss all of the Derby preps. I mean, obviously he had some kind of setback over the winter that has caused him to, come back basically 3 weeks before the Kentucky Derby and not have a chance to make the field. So that's a little bit of a negative for me, but he obviously has won him with a chance in this race. I mean, the one other horse that we should talk about, Craig, is the 8, Encino, the Brad Cox trainee. Scratched out of the Bluegrass last week where he drew the far outside post position. Instead, going to run in this Lexington. Maybe that's a slight negative because seems like he's a horse that's a little deficient on points. And by running in Lexington, they're kind of saying, maybe we're going to leave it up in the air whether or not, even if we win this race, we'll have the points to get into the Derby. I think if he wins, he'll have 40 points, which puts him right on the cusp. Whereas running in the Bluegrass, if you do well there, you can be guaranteed of a spot. He ran a big speed figure last time, and I guess you could say that form was somewhat flattered by Epic Ride, who came back and was somewhat surprisingly a good third in the Bluegrass.
He was. I wonder, do you know the story why this horse wasn't in the Jeff Ruby Stakes? Was that by design? Because, I mean, with his synthetic form, it sure seemed like he would have fit him to a T.
I think it's scheduling, Craig. And I don't know why they do it this way, but they run the Jeff Ruby only 3 weeks after the John Battaglia. And you notice a lot of the horses from the John Battaglia did not run back in the Jeff Ruby. Epic Ride waited for the Bluegrass. I think it's tough for these connections to run a horse back in 3 weeks. We saw it between the Southwest and the Rebel. I know that wasn't the original schedule, but most horses didn't compete in both of those races. I think the connections that are preparing these horses for the Derby, they just generally want to space the races out more these days.
Yeah, I didn't realize how close they were this year, and that's definitely not Brad Cox's MO. What about, do you see this horse as being a dirt horse, given that he's been on the synthetic by, looking at his breeding? I mean, by Bernardini, I guess it's okay. Out of Nyquist, that's not really my level of expertise, but when I watched this horse, I watched the replays from his last couple, including his maiden win, and it just didn't seem like a real dirt turn of foot to me. He seemed like he was really comfortable in the synthetic. So personally, I would be surprised if this horse is a really top third horse and as good as he was on the synthetic.
Yeah, I mean, his dam side pedigree is mostly dirt. The dam is actually a half sister to Street Sense, who, of course, won the Kentucky Derby. So there's dirt there. Nyquist, I mean, the prodigy of Nyquist, they do everything. I mean, he is one of the most versatile sires out there. Yeah, watching the races, I kind of saw the same thing, Craig. He's got a little bit more of that turfy, synthy action to him that I wonder if he's really going to be as effective on the dirt. I haven't been able to catch any of his dirt workouts. He's had 3 at Keeneland. None of the videos were available of those. So I don't know how he's been working on the dirt. He's just the kind of horse I would need a price on him. 5-1 that he is on the line. To me, it's a little light. For horses that have run similar speed figures like Liberal Arts and Hades, or at least Liberal Arts, Hades runs slower, but I mean, they've done it on the dirt, and they've done it against good horses on the dirt. So I'd be more inclined to trust them. And I don't think Encino is going to be some big price, just given the fact that he's like a Dolphin Brad Cox horse, and these types always take money. So he wasn't for me, and I wanted to just go in other directions in this Lexington.
Yeah, same for me.
Well, let's move on to the final leg of this Pick 5 sequence, race 11. It is an allowance event, non-winners of one other than mile and a 16th for the 3-year-olds on the turf, and tough way to close things out, Craig, because this is a really difficult race to handicap. Lukewarm favorite at best with the number 9 Moonlight. A lot of ways to go. I mean, I guess we do have to start by discussing Moonlight because he's the class of this field, obviously. All of that class, I mean, it's come in dirt races. Having faced horses like Dornox, Sierra Leone, Track Phantom, Catching Freedom. I mean, he's running some of the best Derby preps, and now they're just kind of going back to basics, getting him on the surface that they started his career on, the turf. And, you're looking at the TimeformUS PPs here. I mean, you'll see there's no speed figure for his debut race. I'll let you talk about that, Craig. That was one of those days where I think either there were few turf races or I think there was all first-time starters, and it's just tough to make speed figures for those. You can see that I pulled up the speed figure notation explanation for that in the TimeformUS PPs. But looking at the company lines, Moonlight faced some good horses on debut and ran well.
He did. I think the issue with that was it might have rained after that race, so there were some other turf races, but these were all horses who ran for the first time on turf, and it turned out it was a pretty decent field. And I mean, maybe we could go back and make a speed figure for it 3 months later, but at this point, I don't know what kind of utility that would really have anyway. It's something I guess I have to think about a little bit. If I were playing the pick five, I would have to have Moonlight on my ticket. Now, I wouldn't feature him prominently. He'd be one that if I was alive with a couple prices in the first 4 legs, I wouldn't want to get knocked out because Moonlight beat me. But if I'm playing this race vertically, I'm going to try to beat him. I mean, it's not a great post position. It's a pretty strong field. I think there's some talented horses in this field, and he seems to have just now, I mean, he had some excuses, but he's just been a little spotty since that maiden win. It looked like they wanted to keep him on turf that day. Then he tried some, I guess they were all Derby points races. I think even the Street Sense might give minimal points if memory serves. They kept him on dirt, and I just think this horse has a lot of questions as one that is going to take some money. So vertically, I would probably try to beat him.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to be 4-1 in this race. I won't be surprised if he's 2-1. I mean, he's a horse with some Derby trail name recognition who's in this convoluted field where there are so many directions to go. Look, I mean, I know as a morning line maker, when you've got a really difficult race like this and so many horses that could potentially take money, you kind of are trying to get the ordinals right. And sometimes you have this inclination to just make a high morning line favorite. But I mean, I think Moonlight's going to take a lot of money in here, and I get it. I mean, his debut race, he lost by a neck to Carson's Run, who came back and won a Grade 1 2 starts later. Now, it was one of those Woodbine Grade 1s, the summer stakes, but he ran really well to win that race. And I would say that Moonlight ran just as well as Carson's Run on debut because he never saw the inside in that only turf race. He was 3 wide around both turns and held on pretty well. Picking this horse, though, Craig, it just almost seems too easy. Like, it almost makes too much sense. I mean, everyone's going to see that he's got the good company lines on the turf. He's got the big speed figures on the dirt. He faced Sierra Leone and Dornoch. It just feels like there are so many arrows pointing to this horse being overbet. He's got Irad Ortiz aboard. I mean, there's just so many angles pointing to this horse, and he still has to do it. He still has to show that he's taken that step forward from 2 to 3 because, let's face it, his Risen Star was just bad. I mean, he didn't show up at all that day. And, it's unclear if he was just a really good 2-year-old last year. And switching back to the turf, maybe he ultimately turns out to be a turf horse, but Todd Pletcher obviously thought that he was doing well enough on dirt to keep him on that surface through the middle of this winter. So I just don't want to take too short a price on a horse like this that I think a lot of handicappers are just going to default to in what is a very confusing race. So I wanted to find some other options. And for me, Craig, the horse that I would be most interested in that I think is one of the more likely winners along with Moonlight would be the number 5, Royal Majesty. And this is a horse that obviously has got a big pedigree. He's by Frankel. He's out of Crown Queen, who was the winner of the Grade 1 QE2 Cup at Keeneland. She's, of course, the half-sister to Royal Delta. I mean, this pedigree doesn't get any better. He debuted over at Newmarket with Roger Varian and ran okay, but has since come into the barn to Bill Mott and won his U.S. debut back in January at Gulfstream. I liked that performance. I know it didn't get the highest speed figure, but I just thought this horse showed some likable attributes to rate and finish pretty well that day. And he had no chance last time in that Colonel Liam. I mean, just look at the TimeformUS pace figures for that race. It was a joke. I mean, I'm actually going to pull up the replay because, I mean, just the amount of grabbing that took place in the opening portions of this race was comical. I mean, this was a race that had horses that had shown speed in 5 furlong turf sprints that the connections decided was their best chance was to rate them in a mile or a race going, a mile. I mean, you had a horse in I think it was Takayo who had done his best running on the front end. And for whatever reason, even though he had all of his best speed figures had come on the front end, his connections decided to rate him in this race. I mean, nobody wanted to show speed in here. And, the number 7 was Royal Majesty. The number 9 was Triple Espresso. I actually did this race on my Horses to Watch show and highlighted both of these horses. Triple Espresso came out of this trip where he was compromised by the pace and almost finished second, was beaten in a photo for second in the Jeff Ruby Stakes. breaks, improving his speed figure considerably. So I think you do want the horses that were pace compromised in here, and you can just see, I mean, they're crawling, and Royal Majesty's at the back of that field. He doesn't make that much of an impact late, but what chance did he have to do so? I think he's a lot better than his overall results indicate. He's drawn a good post position, and with the presence of a horse like Moonlight, I think he could be a fair enough price in this race. So he is the one that I could kind of, key in on as the horse that I would want to build some of my wagers around.
Yeah, I landed on 2 horses in this race that I'm really interested in, and he's one of them. He's probably the one I would like the most. He's going to be a shorter price than the other one. And I think the chart's worth looking at for this race. It's one where you showed the replay, but it's also one that just got a huge TimeformUS upgrade. The final time figure was only an 84. We upgraded it almost 19 points for the winner. When you start looking at the run backs, there are some huge run backs in here, and it kind of shows it was the right call. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. It's what you have to do when the pace is really slow. You kind of make a guess, but it looks like a really strong race. We saw Cugino last weekend just have a really tough trip loss running a 109. We've had some other good efforts coming out of them, but all the horses have run back to the speed figure assigned that day. So I think it was a really good race. I don't want to give Junior Alvarado a pass. I mean, he was one of those guys yanking back. But in this particular case, it looks like there's going to be some pace in this race. The TimeformUS pace projector shows it as a fast pace. There is some speed in here. So I think he's going to be pretty dangerous with a much more realistic trip. The other horse I'm interested in, too, at a much bigger price is the horse just to his outside in Gorilla Trek. And unlike the favorite in here, Moonlight, who kind of ran that big off the turf race and they decided to go one with him on dirt, he's a horse who's just been really unlucky trying to run on the turf. He's had 3 races in a row come off the turf. He had a synthetic race in the interim. But when you watch this horse's first 2 turf races, his debut in the Bourbon Stakes at Keeneland, I think he's actually pretty darn good. He ran really nice speed figure in his debut with a 97 at a big price for Phil Bauer, who's been pretty hot lately. And when you watch his Bourbon replay, this horse, basically, it was over at the start. He just was shuffled way back. He didn't get out of the gate clean. And I still thought he ran okay with a decent speed figure. So I just think this horse has some really hidden form. I think those dirt races have dirtied him up quite a bit. And for me, I'm just really interested in this horse. I think he's going to offer a lot of value. I think the pace is going to suit him if it gets a little bit warm on the front end. And I just think he might get overlooked. So the 5 and the 6 for me, I'm really interested in, particularly in verticals. And if I was playing pick 5s in a sequence where I probably have spread in at least a couple of the legs already, I'd probably try to narrow it down to some prices like these 2.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Gorilla Trek because you're right. I mean, they have wanted this horse on the turf and they've been unable to get him on that surface since the Bourbon. I wish he had run a little better in the Bourbon because there was pace in that race. Can Group went last to first, and Gorilla Trek didn't save nearly as much ground as that horse, but he just didn't make a move through the stretch, and I was hoping to see more from him. His debut is a race that, even though the speed figure comes up big in TimeformUS, it's one of those that probably could have had the F notation because there were a lot of lightly raced horses in there. And it's one that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. A lot of horses have regressed out of it. So I just wonder about this horse's overall quality a little bit, Craig, but I do think he's going to be close to that 20-1 morning line. And I mean, he is a horse that, just looking at his form, he wants to be on the turf, and he's finally getting back on the turf. So if pace does develop, I'm not going to be surprised when he is charging late and runs well at a big price. And the other thing that I wanted to point out about him, Craig, is, I mean, Phil Bauer, I mean, I don't recall him always winning at this high of a rate, but I mean, if you look up his stats in Formulator, I'm not going to demonstrate it right now, but I mean, over the past year or so, I mean, his ROI is well north of $3 from a $2 wager. I mean, he has just been overperforming expectations for well over 12 months now. And he's, a trainer that's been a little streaky in the past, but he's just been doing a fantastic job recently. So I think you have to give a long look to all of his horses, and a trainer that does tend to do well at the Keeneland meet. So definitely a horse that I think is a little interesting. What do you make of the number 1, Pure Poetry, Craig? He's one of those that is shown contesting the pace on the pace projector. Went gate to wire last time for Brad Cox off the layoff at Fairgrounds. Got a nice speed figure for that maiden win. Now he's second off the layoff. This horse has a big pedigree by Quality Road out of the multiple turf stakes winning mare Dickinson. He's a full brother to a horse named Wadsworth, who was a multiple turf stakes winner for these connections. I'm not going to be surprised if this one turns out to be pretty good. It's just the kind of horse that I could see taking money for connections that are very popular, and I wouldn't want to go too short on a horse like this that still has some things to prove.
Yeah, my notes are this horse is probably pretty good. I think the speed figure is totally legit. He's another one when you look in the chart. The run backs have been good. Rock and Roll Bolt moved the dirt and ran a big figure. Night Out, who was third, ran a winning race with a slightly improved speed figure. So I think he's good. The real question with him is the pace. I don't like to pigeonhole horses like this. He's only run twice as being a front runner. But he's been on the front end on an open lead both times. So I tend to think that's probably what he wants to do. And that might get him in a little bit of trouble in here with horses like Incinerator, who's trying turf for the first time, but has shown speed on the dirt. Beyond Stoked, who is drawn outside. Seems like he's going to have to go. He's shown some good tactical speed. Even St. Armand's Key, who is the 8 horse and a horse who's probably going to take some money and has shown some ability. He's shown plenty of speed. So like I said, it's always possible. Maybe Pure Poetry just lets a couple of those horses go, rates in the pocket, and, gets a good trip and can kick out and finish strongly. But I don't know if you want to take what I think will be a shortish kind of price on there. I won't be surprised if this horse is the second choice. So he's got some questions for me, but he certainly could win. It wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, Pure Poetry is a horse that when I first handicapped this race, I dismissed because I typically figure these horses will be overbet. But as I looked at this race more and I kind of came to the conclusion that Moonlight would take a lot of money in this race, I was thinking maybe Pure Poetry would be around that 6-1 morning line. And I don't know if that's a terrible price on him because he showed ability last time. I agree. Comes out of a strong race, drew the rail again, probably going to go forward. We'll see how fast he has to go on the lead, but I think this horse might be pretty good. So I ended up wanting to include him somewhere, even though I kind of was initially thinking maybe he'd be one I could dismiss. And I wanted to talk about the other horse that I think will be forward in this race, the 3 Incinerator, who you mentioned is also shown forwardly on the pace projector. They're putting blinkers on for this race. And I just wanted to demonstrate a couple of things in DRFTV. His trainer, Arnaud Delacour, a lot of trainers don't have great first-time turf numbers. It's a tough thing to do. And I wanted to show some stats for Arnaud Delacour. And when you look up the first-time turf stats in Formulator, I always like to add the exclude first-time starters parameter to it under days between starts, just to kind of get the first-time starters out of the sample, because we're looking for horses that are switching surfaces to try turf for the first time. And he does pretty well. I mean, there are prices in this sample, 9 for 43, 21% with a $2.68 ROI. So, I mean, for first-time turf, a stat that's bad for most trainers, that's actually pretty good. And the other thing I wanted to show with Incinerator is he is trying turf for the first time. And while there's not a ton of dam side pedigree, he's out of a Speightstown dam, so okay. But Flame Away, who is a new sire, has been putting up some really good stats with his turf horses, and I'll put up these DRF sire statistics that you can access from Formulator. And he hasn't had a ton of turf starters so far, but I mean he's gone 5 for 24 with his turf sprint starters, 10 for 54 with his turf route starters. So he's 15 for 78 overall on the turf. That's a 19% win rate. So, I mean, he's not nearly matching those numbers on the dirt. And you typically expect most sires, even when they're more turf inclined, to have comparable dirt and turf numbers. So these Flameaways have really been moving up on the turf. And I think it's interesting that Incinerator is now getting on the surface for the first time for a trainer that does this well. And he's shown some ability on the dirt already. So he's one that could go off at a square price in this race. I could see him being double digits. And just based on that evidence, he's one that I definitely want to include as well.
Yeah, I can see that. My notes said that Delacour is really good first time on turf. Didn't know about the breeding. Ask David. So you went ahead and covered that for us. So nice use. And I'm glad you pointed out about that Formulator excluding first time starters. That's something that I do as well. Something that I think can skew the sample if you don't do it.
Well, Craig, anybody else you want to bring up in this race? I mean, it's another one of these races where we could probably spend a whole hour of this podcast talking about it, because there's interesting things to point out about many of these runners, but you do have to narrow things down at some point. And I think we've gotten the conversation down to about 4 or 5 horses. So as long as you're good for me to move on, Craig, you can interrupt if you're not. Let's do our recap, and we'll go through and discuss how we might put together a ticket like this. And based on our conversation, I don't think it's going to be easy, because there are a lot of ways to go in these races. I'll let you start off, Craig, with the Giants Causeway, and then we'll go from there, and I'll respond to what you say and give some of my own ideas.
Yeah, so in the Giants Causeway, I'm interested in BG Warrior. I think she's a chance she could just run away from him, and she's going to be a big price, so I want to use her. But if I was playing it, I'd use some others in here. I think Bling is interesting if she can come off the layoff well. I think you obviously have to use Roses for Deborah if she runs back to her races, as we saw in her good 3-year-old season, the part where she was running well. I think she certainly makes a lot of sense in here. And I don't want to totally dismiss Ouvray and Love Reigns, who you made a good case for Love Reigns. And despite the dirt winds and the varying distances, I think this is actually the spot that fits Ouvray the best, these turf sprints.
Oh, you can go on, Craig. You can do the whole pick 5 sequence.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah. Then in the allowance race, this one's a little tricky. I would use Transect as probably my A horse in here. I'm not going to get beat if Classic Catch wins. I got to have him on my ticket, and we'll see if Giant Game actually shows up. If he does, I would probably get him on my ticket. Otherwise, it's probably it for me, just those 2 that I mentioned. In the Jenny Wiley, I just think there's so many ways to go in here, but it's one where I'm going to narrow it down. I would have 2 A horses in here, English Rose and Gina Romanica. I would probably use Didia as a B horse, maybe a C, depending. I think the other 2 are probably better fillies and mares, but that would be about it for me. I mean, you can only spread so much in these races. In the Lexington, I know we're going to vary a little bit here. I'm going to key on Lucky Jeremy, but I would also use the Wine Steward and Liberal Arts. I'm not going to use Haiti at all in here. That would be about it for me in that race. And then in that last allowance race for 3-year-olds, Royal Majesty would be an A. Gorilla Trek would be either an A or a B. Just it kind of depends how my ticket shakes out. And I wouldn't want to get beat by Pure Poetry or Incinerator. And maybe I could squeeze Moonlight in if on a ticket with some of the other price horses that I'm using. But otherwise, I don't want to lean on that one. The 5 and the 6 would be my 2 keys.
And for me, I'll try to break it down into some potential ABC strategy, but it's a tough one to do that. And I might have to, pare things down even further when I put it in Ticket Maker and try to make this an affordable ticket. In the Giants Causeway, I might make my main 3, the 2 Bling, the 8 Roses for Deborah, and the 12 Love Reigns. I don't like to have 3 A horses in a race like this. So if I demoted 1 to a B, it would probably be Roses for Deborah. Even though she's probably the most likely winner of those, I just think she's going to be the strongest favorite and maybe offer less value than the other 2. So if I'm making a value-based decision about the ABC horses, I'd lean towards going 2 12 A's and the 8 a B. And the others would be all either X's or C's for me. I'll see if I can afford to throw in some C's, but I want to mostly get through that first leg with 3 horses. This 8th race, the allowance, is a tough one for me, and I'm kind of going to reluctantly make Classic Catch my only A and Transect the B, and then just kind of leave it there. Giant Game, if he's the one to run here, maybe he's a potential C. But I really kind of want to get through this race with 2 horses. They're the 2 morning line favorites. It's not super clever, but they just feel like the right horses to me in a race where I had trouble getting too creative. In the Jenny Wiley, Craig and I agree on English Rose. She's an A for me as well. If I threw in another A, it would be between Surge Capacity and Bout Cachet, and I'm kind of leaning, the more I talk about it, towards making Bout Cachet the one that I upgrade, the number 10, just because I get this sense that maybe she could be the speed of this race, and I could be totally wrong about that, but I just wonder if that's going to be the plan for Chad Brown, and I think she's the difference in quality between her and some of the others for that barn is not so large that she doesn't have a chance if the trip works out for her. And then, others that I could use, obviously Surge Capacity, who I mentioned, and then more C types for me would be Elusive Princess, Gina Romantica, and then Diddy as kind of straddling B and C status for me. I want to have her in there somewhere because I respect her so much, but I don't know if I expect her to offer the kind of value that I think others will in this Jenny Wiley, at least based on my opinion. In the Lexington, I kind of ended up switching a couple horses in my A-B breakdown as we talked about it. I still like Hades, but I'm going to switch my Liberal Arts and Lucky Jeremy. I'm going to make my two A's in here, Hades and Lucky Jeremy, and make Liberal Arts more of a B, just because as I think about this pace more, I think Liberal Arts could be the one that's a little more up against it because I don't see that much pace in this race. And I think Craig made some really good points about Lucky Jeremy having the form and potentially getting the right trip in the Lexington. And then closing things out, Royal Majesty is definitely an A for me in race 11. Whether or not I have another A is going to be dictated by how expensive this ticket is getting. I'm kind of thinking I won't have the budget for it based on how much I usually like to spend on these. But the horses I would like to put in there as Bs are the 1 Pure Poetry, the 3 Incinerator, and then it's kind of a decision between whether I want to put in the value of the 6 Gorilla Trek or the safe option of the number 9 Moonlight. And I might lean towards putting in Gorilla Trek. I mean, Craig made good points about him. And while I have some doubts about his overall quality, he just feels like the real value horse in that last leg. Whereas Moonlight could be overbet. And while I wouldn't want to get totally knocked out by him, he is at worst a C for me. Generally, I want those horses that detract from the value of my wagers to be relegated to C status. And I want to put the horse that I think are going to create value in the sequence as my A's and B's. So that's just my strategy that I've obviously laid out before on this podcast for tackling that ABC methodology with regard to these pick fives. It's not an easy sequence, Craig. Like we said, if we're right about it, it's going to pay well, even if, favorites come in. I mean, even if, let's say, Classic Catch wins that 8th race and Moonlight closes it out for the same connections, I still think there is going to be enough value in those wide open races that surround it that this is not going to be a pick 5 sequence that's going to pay pennies.
No, and that's why you play multiple tickets. So if you're playing favorites, even in all the legs, you don't want to have tickets where 4 favorites win. You kind of spread them out, and that's why you tier the horses. It's not easy to do, but I think it's worth the time to make sure your tickets have some value. Otherwise, there's just no point in playing them because you're going to get killed if you're betting pick 5, just playing big caveman tickets. And the favorites are going to come in more often than you like, and it's going to kill your price. So just take time. If you haven't used Ticket Maker, it is definitely worth giving it a shot and kind of read up on it and how to use it, because I think there's some value and it can really help your bankroll in the long run.
And on a future episode, maybe we'll go through that, putting together a ticket. Obviously, we've gone a little overtime in our first attempt at using video on the podcast. We're over an hour and a half at this point, and I know it's a little long for some of those, especially those listening on podcast platforms. So apologies for being a little bit long-winded on this one, but we'll try to streamline it in the future. Everybody, wherever you're listening, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube now with video. And if you're watching on YouTube, I hope you appreciated some of the use of the PPs we're able to incorporate, and definitely drop us any comments either in the YouTube comments or with the Twitter handles that Craig and I have on screen if you want to make any comments about how we're doing this in the future. So everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Forecast this week, and good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.